In this example, I want to go through table view controllers and how they fit into Xcode. And what table view controllers are going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to render our data. And we'll use table view controllers for a lot of different scenarios, but for this example, I just kind of want to get into the simplest version that we can, knowing that when we're accessing our data and using table view controllers, we're going to be using kind of an MVC design pattern. So what I want to do is I want to create that project and actually use that MVC design pattern. So model, view, view model, controller model. I'm going to go ahead and create a new Xcode project. And it's going to be an app. And it's going to be table view controllers. So a storyboard is fine. And I'm just going to go ahead and save it on my desktop. Okay, and to kind of set the stage, what I want to do is I want to delete the original storyboard view controller, so that's gone, so there are no scenes. And I want to add a table view controller to the storyboard that's going to hold data about some object. And I'm arbitrarily picking the object pets. And if I look on my desktop, I've got a few pictures of dogs. So I have a boxer, a pug, and a wire-haired terrier. So I got some dog pictures. I want to bring those dog pictures over to my project. So I'm going to bring them into my assets directory. So I'm just going to drag and drop them in to the project. Okay, so that data is part of the project. And then what I want to do is I want to render these objects as pets. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add a new class definition. So new file, it's going to be a Swift file. And the Swift file that I want is, I'm going to call this my pet, and it's going to contain my pet class definition. Okay, so my class definition for a pet is going to include all of the attributes that I care about for a pet. So I care about the pet's name. I care about the pet's weight. And I care about the pet's profile picture. So I'm going to have another variable called profile pic file name, which will just be a string. And then I have to provide an initializer, so I'm going to have an init that takes a name, a weight, and a profile pic as a string, and initializes all of those local instance variables, so name, weight, and profile pic. So self.name will equal the incoming parameter, self.weight will equal the incoming parameter, and self.profilepic file name will equal this profile pic. Okay, so we have an initializer for our class definition. And it's going to be a fairly straightforward class definition. I think that makes sense for this demo, just to have a class definition called pet that's going to then have pet data, name, weight, and then their profile pic. This data is going to represent our model. And when we think about this data could be, here's a list of all pets coming from a database or a web service or something like that. And eventually we'll get to that point where we're getting our data from services. But for the time being, for this project, what we want to do is we want to get data. So we want to get pet data, but we're going to hard code that pet data. So we're just going to have a couple of pets that we want to render out. We're going to hard code that pet data. So for the time being, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a pet manager class. So I'm going to add a new file called pet manager. And the idea here is that this class definition for pet manager would then be in charge of managing the underlying data regarding our model, which is the pets. Okay, so our model, whether we're getting this from an API or a database or wherever we're getting that data, our application is going to be focused on pets, and our data is related to pets. So since our data is related to pets, this is our model. So our model is a pet with a name, a weight, and a profile pic. And then our pet manager is going to be in charge of, maybe creating new pets and editing pets and deleting pets and selecting all the pets. So for this example, since we're dealing with table view controllers, eventually we'll get to kind of all of those data management methods. So create, read, update, delete. But for the time being, what we want to do is we want to be able to have some existing data, so some existing pet data, and we want to be able to render out that pet data. So for the time being, our pet manager is going to be responsible for retrieving pet objects. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to have a method for our pet manager class that retrieves pets. So we'll have a function called getAllPets. And when we get all the pets, what we want to do is we want to return a collection of pet objects. So our return type is going to be a collection of pets, so an array of pet objects. Okay, and we're missing a return, that's fine. So what I want to do is I want to create a variable called allPets. It's going to be a pet array, and when I initialize it, it's just going to be equal to an empty array. And eventually we're going to return all of our pets. So now we're not missing a return value. So we never mutate it. Well, we're going to mutate it. We want to add some pets. So all pets dot append a new element. Our new element is going to be a pet with all of our data. So a string for the name. So Penny will be the first pet. Penny the pug will be 19 pounds, and the profile picture is going to be a reference to this file name, so it's just going to be pug. Okay, so our profile pic is going to be pug. And then we want to do the same thing for all the other pets. So we have Willie, the 43-pound wire hair. And then we have another boxer, so Benny, the 84-pound boxer. Okay, so those are the pets that we've added to our pet manager. And what we want to do then is this function should get all of our pets. We can use this function, but I would argue that the pet manager and the pet are both related to our data. So what I want to do is I'm going to add a new group to my project called models. And the models that I have are the pet and the pet manager, and I'm going to add those two class definitions to my models. Okay. The views are pretty straightforward as well, so I'll go ahead and take care of that now too. So I'm going to say I want a new group called views, and the views that I'm going to have is going to be the main storyboard. So all the different storyboards that make up my user interface are going to be part of the view, so that's pretty straightforward. And then the way we're going to handle this is right now we have this view controller Swift, and it's not doing anything, so we can go ahead and delete this file. Because if you remember, in our storyboard, we got rid of the one view controller on the scene that was there because we're no longer using it. What we want to do instead is we want to create a new view controller. So I'm going to actually search for a table view controller, and I'm going to bring that onto the project. Okay, and I'm going to shrink the size down a little bit. Okay, so this is my view. And I want to make this my initial view controller, so we're all good there. And I'm going to set the title as pets. And it's a table view controller. Okay, so that's what's getting rendered here, and we can kind of see the content. The way this works is we have a table view, and then we have these repeating cells within the table view. So within a table view cell, each table view cell is going to have content that's going to render. And the idea here is that we're going to have repeating records that are going to render each of our corresponding pets with our data. Okay, that's kind of the setup of this project. Okay, so as we go, we can do a couple of things. So I want to create my controller for this project. And the way the controller works is if I come over and I say I want to add a new file, which is going to be a Cocoa Touch class, and I derive from a UI view controller. We've done that in the past. And we say, you know, this is our pets view controller. Okay, this ends up being not that interesting. So our pets view controller doesn't have a ton of stuff in here, but the way we've typically done this in the past is we have this pets view controller, it's a UI view controller, then we'd come over to the views in our storyboard and we'd wire it up so that this controller is then matched to our pets view controller. Okay, that's not what we want to do in this case because this is a special type of view controller now. This is a table view controller. Okay, so we don't want a pets view controller that's just derived from view controller. We want to have it derived from UI table view controller. Okay, and what that does is it makes this class different. And by different, what ends up happening is because it's a UI table view controller, the UI table view controller class definition implements a protocol. And really what we're talking about there is the UI table view controller. If I go ahead and hold down the control key, I want to say it's the control key, maybe it's the option key. So as I'm holding down the option key, you'll see this question mark here. So if I click on that, it's going to take me over to the help. Okay, and what it does is it gives me the iOS help, and I can go into the developer documentation. But what's going to happen is basically it's going to say that the UI table view controller implements the UI table view protocol. Okay, and that doesn't mean a lot to us, but what I want to do is I want to kind of start this class again. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this file. Just going to move it to the trash. And instead of creating a file that's derived from UI view controller, I want to create a file that's derived from UI table view controller. And I'm going to call it my pets table view controller. And it's a subclass of, and if I bring this drop-down list down, you'll see the UI table view controller. Okay, because I'm subclassing it with UI table view controller, what's going to happen is Swift and iOS and Xcode are smart enough to say, okay, because it's a table view controller, then table view controller implements this protocol, and because it implements this protocol, then you're required to implement certain methods, and we'll see that in this class definition. Okay, so now we end up with the fact that this is a table view data source, this table view controller. It's a table view data source. This is the protocol that it actually implements, and it's going to require me to implement these functions: the number of sections in a table view, the number of rows in a section within a table view. It's going to ask me to get a cell at an index path. Okay. And then there's other things that I can do to support editing and deleting and drag and drop to rearrange the table view. So, but there are some required things that we're going to need to do. But before we start coding in this table view controller, there's a couple of things that I want to do. This is a controller, right? It's fairly obvious just from the name, the fact that it's deriving from a UI table view controller. So controllers in the name. This is one of our controller classes. So when we're talking about this Mvc architecture, we're going to be dealing with a controller. So here's my controllers. And this pets table view controller is going to go right in there. Okay. And then the other thing that I want to do is if I go back to my storyboard, now this table view controller can then be mapped to my pets table view controller, like we've always done. Okay, if I run this right now, I think it'll run, but it's not going to render any data. And I accidentally launched it on the iPod Touch, which should be fine for this example, as opposed to launching it on an iPhone. But you'll notice that we don't end up with any data here. We get a bunch of what looks like a table, but we don't end up with any of our pets data or anything like that. So not working quite the way we want, but we'll get there. Okay, so let's go back to our table view controller class. Okay, and the first thing we have to do in our table view controller class is I'm going to go ahead and just delete some of these comments so that our code's a little bit cleaner. Okay, eventually we're going to want to deal with some of these comments, but for now I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of them. The first thing that this view controller is going to need to do is it's going to need to access our data. So our pets table view controller is going to need data that it can actually render. So the first step here is that our pets table view controller is going to go to our models classes. It's going to go to the pet manager and it's going to ask for all of the pets. Okay, so I'm going to have a variable that's inside this class definition that's going to store our pets array. So here's our variable pets. It's going to be an array of pet objects. And by default, I'm going to initialize it to an empty array, just so I don't have to provide an initializer for the class definition. And then what I want to do is I want to actually replace it. Okay, so I want to replace it. I could make it optional and not initialize it to an empty array, but I'm choosing to make it an empty array so I can avoid the whole process of dealing with the optionals all the time. So what I'm going to do in the viewDidLoad is I want to populate that. So I want to say self.pets is going to be equal to my pet manager class, and I want to create an instance of a pet manager class. So here's my pet manager equal to a pet manager. Okay, and then I should be able to go to my pet manager, and there's a method getAllPets. And what I'm going to suggest is that I don't necessarily want to handle it this way. And what I mean by that is if I go back over to my model class, here's my pet manager, I don't necessarily ever want to create a pet manager. I just want to be able to get all the pets. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say here's a static function. And what the static function does is it attaches this method to the class as opposed to an instance of the class. So now I don't have to instantiate a pet manager to then call getAllPets. I can just use the class definition to call that function getAllPets. Okay, so I'm going to go back over to my view controller, and now I can use the class definition, pet manager, and there's a getAllPets method that I can invoke. And I'm not sure why that didn't come up in IntelliSense. It kind of looks like it needs to recompile, but I'm confident that I should be able to get all the pets here from my pet manager class. Okay, so that populates this local variable. Okay, so then I get into the fact that because I'm derived from UI table view controller, that forces the requirement of being a table view data source on this class definition. And table view data source, what we're talking about there is it's a protocol that I have to implement. And because I'm implementing that protocol, because I say that I'm a table view data source, it comes with some requirements of methods that I have to implement. So the first one is number of sections. Okay, so by default there are 0 sections. What I want to do is I want to say that there is 1 section for my table. Okay, and sections basically allows me to say, you know, I can have a section of 3 pets, and then another section of 3 pets. And so basically I could provide groupings of pets. So if I have 50 pets, I could say there's 5 groups of 10 or 10 groups of 5, something like that. But for this, I'm just going to hard code the value 1, so there's just one section that's going to contain all of my data is basically what we're saying there. The next one is the table view number of rows in section. So this function right here. So the number of rows in section, this is going to depend on how many pets I actually have. Okay, so instead of returning 0, I actually do want some rows in my section. I have one section that's going to contain all of my pets. So instead of hard coding this as 0, I'm just going to go to my variable self.pets and ask what the count is. Okay, so it's going to give me a count of how many pets we're actually trying to render. And then the last thing that we're going to need to implement is this DQ reusable cell. So this cell for row at index path. This function right here, table view cell for row at index path. And then you'll notice that the first thing that happens is that there's a call here, let cell equal to table view.dq reusable cell with an identifier where I have this reuse identifier for an index path. Let's look at our storyboard, and I think this will make more sense. Okay, and the way this is going to work is if I'm looking at my table view and I have a table view cell, and we look in here, there is a reuse identifier for that cell right here. And the idea is that in order to increase efficiency, iOS is not going to render out, let's say I had 1,000,000 pets. It's not going to render out 1,000,000 pet cells as I scroll through this table view because it enables scrolling. What ends up happening is that it only creates enough cells for the records in the table view that are visible at that moment in time. And then what ends up happening is, in order to save memory, instead of creating cells for every record, what it does is it creates cells for the records that need to be displayed, and it'll reuse those cells. So what ends up happening is I have to put a reuse identifier on the cell. So I'm selecting the cell, and I'm going to name it essentially. So I'm going to call this my pet cell. Okay, because we're rendering a pet within that cell. We have that reuse identifier, so then if I go back to my controller, that's what's going to go here in this reuse identifier is that pet cell that I just set up in my storyboard through Interface Builder. Okay. I have this cell, and the cell is really what gets rendered within my table view. And when I look at a cell, there's a couple of things that are going to, and I'm not getting what I actually want here. I want to be able to actually look at the cell. So I'm just going to go ahead and rebuild this. So I ran it just to rebuild it, so we end up with this table view. It's not very exciting, but I'm going to go ahead and stop it. What that did is it rebuilt it, and then what it'll allow me to do, and I'm not seeing why. I'm going to take you out to Google, and we can look at a UI table view cell. So I'm just going out to the developer documentation. Okay, so we're going to be dealing with one of these things. That's what the pet cell is. And the way the cell works is there's a couple of different types of cells that we could get. One is that we get a cell with content only, one with an accessory view. So, and again, this goes back to our cell type. And then we can get a cell that's in edit mode. We can configure our cell a couple of different ways. I just want to show you what we're looking at. I don't know that that's necessarily that helpful. I wonder if this will actually show. This is pretty old. Okay, so let's actually just handle it through code. So I have this cell. It's a UI table view cell. And then what I can do, just so that we can actually see the data. So what's happening is I think Xcode's not figuring out that this is a UI table view cell. So I'm going to go ahead and explicitly say this is a UI table view cell. And then what it'll allow me to do then is it'll allow me to look at the different, it's still not allowing me to see anything in here. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kill Xcode here and see if I can actually bring this up and actually get IntelliSense to work. Because for some reason my IntelliSense and all of the different attributes that should be associated with that table view cell are not coming up. So I'm just going to reopen that project. So it's almost like Xcode had crashed. Interesting that it's still not showing. Okay, now it is. So you'll notice one of the things that I can do with the cell is I can set the text label. Okay, so this is actually putting text inside the cell. So by default, each cell is going to be content only. And the content we can set through that text label. So in our case, let's just go ahead and set the name of the text to our pet name. So I want to show each of the different pets. So if I go back over to my pet manager, we have 3 pets. We have Penny, Willie, and Benny. Those are the 3 pet names. And that's what I want to render within our table. Okay, so I'm going back over to my controller. And the way I'm going to set the text for each individual cell is based on, it's basically a parallel array concept. And the idea here is that at my table for row 0, I want the pet at index 0 within my pets array. Okay, so I'm going to go to self.pets. I have my data. And then I want to index into my data, so I want a specific index. And then I'm going to grab the name of that pet. Okay, so the way I'm going to index in to the pets array is I am past this index path. So this index path contains the row or the column. So in our case, we just want the row. Okay, so we're able to get the row, and that's allowing us to kind of have parallel arrays. So in the table at row 0, we're using the pet from index 0 within our array. And then we're going to return that cell, and that's what we want to render out. And if all of this is working correctly, so we set the number of sections in a table view, we have the table view's number of rows in a section equal to the number of pets that we have. And then we have the table view cell for row at index path, where all we're doing is setting the text to a pet's name. What should happen then is our table view should then render out our pets, as that's the only content. We should have the name for each of our pets if this is running correctly. Okay, and you'll notice that we get Penny, Willie, and Benny, so we get our pets here in our table view. Okay, and I don't know if that's necessarily that interesting or anything like that, because our pets have a weight and they have a picture that we want to associate with them. So we want to customize this cell a little bit. One way we can customize it is we could certainly get more complicated with our string. And by that I mean we could say using something like this. So the pet name weighs self.pets index path.row weight pounds. Okay, so we're just changing our text, and we're basically grabbing the weight of each of the animals, but we're not getting the profile pic. And getting the profile pic is not necessarily the most straightforward. I could use a different cell type, so I could certainly change the cell type. But I think a better approach to this is to, if we go over to the view, is we're in charge of what this cell actually looks like, and we can really get into some customization with regards to the cell. Okay, so right now this cell's content view is just a cell and there's nothing to it. But what I want to do is I want to customize it. So I want to have the picture of the pet on the left hand side and then that text content on the right hand side. And I may want to have two separate labels, one for the name, one for the weight. But for this case, I'm just going to have one label. But I'm in charge of how this actually renders out. But in order to do that, I have to add a new file. It's going to be a Cocoa Touch class. And what I want to do is I actually want to derive from the UI table view cell. And I want to create a custom cell for my pets. So I'm going to call this my pet table view cell. And I'm going to store it in my controllers, because that's part of my controller class. Okay, and it's a UI table view cell, so there's a couple of methods that need to be implemented. But for the most part, I can kind of ignore those. What I am going to do is in the storyboard now is this pet cell I'm going to mark as a specific data type. So it's my pet table view cell. So that cell is a specific class. And then within that class, I want to add a couple of user interface objects. I want to add a UI image view and then a label. Okay, so I'm going to search for image. It's an image view. I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop it into that cell. So you can see how it's in the cell. And I'm going to drop it. It goes underneath the content view of that cell. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to anchor it to the content view. So I'm going to set up some constraints in the content view. I'm going to say that it should have equal height. I'm going to then set the leading space, the top space, and the bottom space equal to the container. Okay, so those constraints are there. And you'll notice that I did not set a constraint on the trailing, but you'll notice that I don't necessarily have the right attributes here that I want. So right now it's saying that the bottom is equal to the image view's bottom minus 45.5. I'm just going to set it equal to 0. The image view height is 2.94, so it's almost 3 times the height. I'm going to say that it's 1 time the height. The leading is -50. I'm going to make it 0. And then the top is -43. I'm going to make it 0. Okay, and I still don't have anything for kind of this trailing spacing. So it's going to complain a little bit about that, but that's okay. Okay, so this UI image view is here. And then what I want to do is I want to add a label as well. So I'm just bringing this label up here. Okay, and I don't know that I need any constraints for the label at this point. I think it's probably fine. I could do something like the label's anchored to the... So I could do something like this where I take the label and I set up constraints with regard to the image view. And I basically say the leading constraint on the label is in relation to the image view. So the labels leading is equal to the image views leading, and I don't want that. The labels leading, what I want to do is I want to say it's equal to the image views trailing. And then I might give it a constant so that there is some space there, maybe 20 pixels of space, so that it's got a little padding between the label and the image view. Okay, and that's how I want my cells to look, and if I run this right now, nothing is going to get rendered. Okay, so I get my label, penny weighs. So I said nothing was going to get rendered, and that's kind of a lie. So obviously something did get rendered. A couple of things. My label by default has some text. I don't want that, so I'm just getting rid of the default text in that label. And then the other thing that's going on is this pet cell has a class of pet table view cell. And right now there's a text label there, but I don't want there to be. I want there to be an image view and a label. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I need a reference to these controls that I just added in that cell. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up the assistant editor. And right now I'm on that cell, so I should have access to, I don't really want the cell, I want the cell, sorry. So I'm actually clicking on one of the content elements within the cell in order to bring up the cell within the assistant editor. And then I'm going to create a little bit of room. And what I want to do is basically I'm going to create an outlet to the image and to the label. So I'm going to control drag from the image to my pet table view cell, which is going to create an outlet. I'm just going to call it my main image. That's how I want to refer to that image. And then the label I'm going to refer to as the main label. Okay, so my cell has a main label and a main image. That's how I want to deal with this. Okay, and then I'm done with the assistant editor. So this image, my outlet is referring to it as the main image, and this label that has no text in it right now is referred to as my main label. Okay, that's how I referred to those outlets. Now if I go back over to my pets table view controller, I no longer have a UI table view cell. I have a pet table view cell. That's what I'm getting out when I DQ a reusable cell. And it's going to complain saying, hey, when you DQ a reusable cell, it's saying that it's just a UI table view cell. You have to cast this. So I'm going to go ahead and cast it. So you'll see when I DQ a reusable cell, I'm saying that I'm getting back out a pet table view cell. Okay. Now that I have that cell, now that I have a specific type of cell, I'm no longer going to set this text label like I was before. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to say the cell's main label, and you'll notice that I'm not getting that IntelliSense, but I'm pretty confident that the code that we have will work. Okay, so I'm setting the text. And we can run this right now, and we should just have this main label's text rendering in my table. Okay, so Penny weighs 19 pounds, Willie weighs 43 pounds, Benny weighs 48 pounds. You'll notice that I have some constraint issues, like I'm not centering this within the cell. So I could work on that a little bit, but it's more constraints than anything else that would make this look nice. But I'm not terribly worried about that at this point, so I'm able to set the cell's main label. And then I want to set the cell's main image. And the main image is a UI image view. So what I really want to do is I want to set the image for that image view. So the image is going to be equal to a UI image named, and then the way I'm going to name that image is I have the name of the image. The name of the image is stored with each individual pet. So what I'm going to do is just make this a little bit more readable. I'm going to create a variable. And then I can use that variable in a couple different spots. So current pet, and then current pet. And then same thing here with the named. I can use current pet to get the profile pic file name. So I'm setting the main image to an image, and then I'm creating a new UI image, which is not a UI image view. It's a little bit different. It's the image within the view. And then we're basically initializing an image and assigning that to the UI image view. Okay, so now we should be able to run this, and we're going to have our profile pics for our pets. And again, I got some constraint issues here. I'm using an old iPod Touch. If I were to scale this up to something a little more modern, like a iPhone 11 Pro or an iPhone 11, I think it'll render out a little bit nicer. Okay, so we have our images. The scaling on the images, they're a little bit different size, but you can see that we're actually getting our data, and we can customize these cells, and we can play around with the constraints to make them look nice. We can do all of those things. We could say that the images within our table view cells are going to be a specific size. Okay, so right now we don't have a height and width associated with them. So what I want to do is I want to add some new constraints. I want to set the height and width to some fixed height and width. So I'm going to say the height and width are going to be 240 by 240 for that image. And if I run this now, you'll notice what's happening is all of the images are 240 by 240, but then because they're not in the same scale, like they don't have the same aspect ratio, what's happening is that we're filling with white space behind, so it keeps the aspect ratio of the original picture, but all of the pictures themselves are 240 by 240. Okay, so we're kind of getting that consistent look of what our pictures are going to look like. I could even take that UI image view and say, you know, I want to change the background to black so that when the picture doesn't scale, because the aspect ratio, you can see how I have that black background now. And maybe that looks a little better, I don't know. We can play around with all of this. Okay, so the idea for today is to get you comfortable with table view controllers, and then within table view controllers, what's required. So due to the fact that we're dealing with table view controllers, each table view controller is going to be a table view data source, meaning it's going to implement that table view data source protocol, which is going to require us to implement these three methods. Have to implement those three methods. Like, how am I actually rendering out the data that my table view is supposed to display? Okay, once I've done that, then I can get into the storyboard and we can start looking at the individual cells. Okay, and the individual cells are fairly limited in what you can do. There's not a ton of options about how you're going to render out your data. And the idea here with this example is that we immediately recognize like the cells themselves are fairly limited, but it's very easy to customize the cells. So we created a custom table view cell and added a couple of controls that we have access to, so specifically an image view and a label. And then what we did is we created outlets for those controls that we set up within our custom cell that allows us to then access those components of our custom cell. So our custom cell has a main label and a main image. And because we're dequeuing our cell as a pet table view cell, that's allowing us to set the main label and main image to render out our content. Okay. Table views and table view controllers and table view cells are used constantly within iOS, all over the place, including navigation. Okay, so this is kind of the first step. We'll have an additional step where we're using our tables to then render out content that allows us to actually modify content. So I might want to be able to add a new pet. I might want to be able to edit an existing pet. I might want to be able to remove a pet. Maybe it's a manager for like an iOS application manager for some kind of rescue. And we keep track of all those pets. Okay, and that's the kind of example that we're kind of going to go forward with. So those types of details. But for the time being, when I first saw table view controllers, they're very confusing to me. But what we really have to keep in mind is when we're dealing with table view controllers, we're really dealing with this MVC architecture. And this MVC architecture is going to force us into a specific method of designing our applications. And once we kind of just accept that our application has to fit that MVC architecture, then things go pretty smoothly with table view controllers. Okay, so I want to stop here kind of as an initial starting point for table view controllers.